Well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you all for coming out. Well, it's always amazing to be in Utah, the only state in the union where I'm the least clean-cut person in the state. I want to thank Young America's Foundation. I want to thank the campus chapter that brought me out, because obviously they did yeoman's work in doing so. I feel bad that we didn't have a bigger venue. Apparently there were a couple thousand more people who wanted to come. I am grateful for all of the hard work, specifically of the University Police Department. So thank you to them. It is the police who, as I have said, are that dividing line between civilization and barbarism. And the reason that we can hold events like this is because there are people who are willing to stand in the line of fire so that I can stand here and talk to you. And it's pathetic that we actually need to have that on a college campus, that we need to have scores of police officers protecting us from people who might get violent. I'm not talking about the people who protest. As was just said, those people are exercising their First Amendment rights. That's great. You know, they want to go out and they want to protest. That's great. It would be better if they would come inside and have a discussion with me. And I'd prefer that they would come and ask questions and we could talk together. But if they're not going to do that, then let them protest outside. But the idea that I need to now have big security teams follow me around. I mean, look, I'm ripped, but I'm not that physically imposing. I mean, here were just some of the security arrangements today, according to the university. Much of the surrounding area will be blocked off, and faculty had the option of relocating their classes to other buildings. There would be significant police presence in that area, as well as President's Circle, to protect both those protesting and attending the event. I doubt that the people attending the event were really the threat here. To promote safety and help ensure orderly conduct, no masks, bandanas, or other face coverings were permitted on campus. Why? Because there were radical groups from both on campus and off who were threatening violence and attempting to shut this event down and bragging about how they were going to attempt to do so. The nice thing is that here in Utah, apparently, even the would-be rebels are blabbermouths. And so they like to talk a lot about what they're going to do and the way they're going to do it. And they like to talk a lot about why they're doing it as well. So I really did appreciate this letter that appeared in the Salt Lake Tribune, courtesy of one Ian Decker, of Students for a Democratic Society, which, frankly, I didn't even know that it existed. Like, is Tom Hayden still alive? Apparently, he was also representing Black Lives Matter and University of Utah Metro. This fellow, and I assume he's a fellow because I want to be very careful. I understand the sensitivities around misgendering. Seems like a total delight. It seems like a total delight. Here's the letter that Ian Decker issued on behalf of these groups. We have no shame in saying that we intend to shut down Ben Shapiro. Right, because you're stupid. This is not a decision we came to based on youthful emotions or out of some desire for the world to be one big safe space. This decision was arrived at based on a real, material understanding of the political environment of Utah and the material effects of an emboldened far right. As an example, Utah is already a state with a homelessness and suicide crisis among LGBTQ youth. Ben Shapiro has openly called transgender people mentally ill. He portrays the gay rights movement as a conspiracy to root out God-based institutions. He has recently defended conversion therapy, which is nothing short of abuse. So here's a litany of stupidity. Number one, the idea that I am responsible for violence against LGBTQ people is delusional. It is fully delusional. I am perhaps the foremost anti-violence speaker on college campuses in America today. Violence is unacceptable under any circumstances. The state has a monopoly on legal violence unless you are reacting in self-defense. That's the beginning. Okay. This notion, by the way, that if I suggest that transgender people are suffering from a mental illness or a mental disorder is fully in line with the DSM-4 as well as the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual governing how psychiatrists actually diagnose illness. As far as the notion that I portray the gay rights movement as a conspiracy to root out God-based institutions, I don't know where this guy's pulling this from. What I have said is that if there are members of the radical gay rights movement who suggest that my synagogue should be forced to perform a same-sex marriage, or that my business should be forced to cater a same-sex wedding, that is obviously an attempt to root out God-based institutions. Clearly. This notion that I've recently defended conversion therapy, again, I don't know where this comes from. To my knowledge, I don't think I've ever actually defended conversion therapy. What I have suggested is that parents, in consultation with their children, have the right to go to psychiatrists, to see psychiatrists for any treatment they choose. It's a free country. That's all. You know, I don't see any real good sociological data that suggests that conversion therapy is effective, or even that you should do it. But as a parent, it is my responsibility how I want to raise my child, and anyone who gets between me, including the state, needs to move to the side. Okay. Also, it says, these are all positions he has stated in naked terms in articles he's written himself, which is clearly not true. To pretend that Shapiro does not spew racist and transphobic pseudoscience with the desire to justify and encourage violence is idealistic, ahistorical, and wrong. So this is where they get down to the nub of it, right? This is where Ian Decker gets down to the nub of it. Number one, I would suggest that the greatest form of pseudoscience today on the public scene is suggesting that a man can magically become a woman. So when I say that if that's transphobic pseudoscience, someone might want to pick up, I don't know, like a fifth grade biology textbook. But the notion that this is a desire to justify and encourage violence. When I was at Berkeley, there was a group outside the venue, and they were chanting, "Speech is violence." And they're chanting this over and over, "Speech is violence," which, again, is idiotic, because that's why it's called speech. Like, if it were violence, it would be called violence. Right? Speech is speech, and violence is violence, and unless the speech is overtly calling for violence, the speech is not linked with the violence. But the idea that if I say something you find offensive, that this is somehow promulgation of violence across the country is merely an excuse for people to get violent against the people with whom they disagree. That is ideological fascism at work under the guise of a smiling, happy face. And says, we intend on shutting down Ben Shapiro precisely because we don't live in a fantasy world where hate speech has no consequences. We believe his hate speech can and will have material consequences for vulnerable people. Again, if you can name one person, one, in America, who has been physically harmed because of my speech, I dare you to find them and show them to me. One. Okay, and I'm not talking about my 3.5-year-old who I had to deprive of ice cream yesterday. I'm talking about someone else. They say this will not be a violent protest, but we intend to exercise our free speech in the boldest and most unapologetic way we can, even if Shapiro, his fans, and the university police would have it otherwise. Again, I would not have it otherwise, that you're outside making fools of yourself. It's great for the cameras, and it just demonstrates that you have no clue what you're talking about. Okay, so now for the actually offensive part of the speech. Okay. Here's the part that the left seems to find so all-fired offensive lately when I talk. You are not a victim. They are not victims. In America, unless you can show me why you are a victim, I am not willing to call you a victim. The idea that America is a terrible, racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobic place that seeks to stop you from pursuing your dreams is utter and complete nonsense. It is utter nonsense. This is America. Okay, you're essentially free to do what you want. That is reality. Freedom is harsh. Freedom is unsparing. It means that you're responsible for your own decisions. And listen, I'm willing to stand next to you, again, if you can show me an instance of someone trying to stop you through racism, sexism, bigotry, homophobia. If you're willing to show me that instance, I'll stand next to you and fight it. But if it's just you blaming your life problems on some ghost out there, if it's you just suggesting that the milieu in which you live is the worst place on earth, let me suggest you visit anywhere else. Okay, so, and when I say this, people on the left for some reason find this non-empowering. To me, this is the most empowering thing that anyone can say to you, is your life is your own and it's your decision what to do with it. That you get to make the decisions that make your life better. This is the basic conservative worldview. You're an individual, no one has to give you anything, but no one's going to get in your way, and it's our job to make sure that people don't get in your way. That is the basic constitutional worldview. That is the viewpoint of the founders of this country, which is why this is the greatest country in world history. The left doesn't believe this, however. The left doesn't believe that you're an individual. The left believes in intersectionality, the idea that you are a member of a group. The left believes in a hierarchy of victimhood. We can tell how much you've been victimized by looking at the color of your skin. We can tell how much you have been victimized by looking at your place of birth. We can tell how much you've been victimized by the kind of clothes you wear. Okay, this is nonsense. But what it does do is it's pretty popular on college campuses because it removes the requirement for you to make good decisions with your life. If you fail, if you suck at life, you don't have to blame you. You can blame everybody else, which is super duper convenient. Now, the way this works is that you form a coalition of people who all believe that their problems are caused by the United States more broadly, and politically speaking, the people who benefit from this are political and media elites who then use that as an excuse to tear down the system itself. The system is so bad, right? You're a black person. You know the system is bad. Join with me, a gay person who knows the system is bad. Join with me, a Latino person who knows the system is bad. We'll tear down the system, and we'll build up a big government system in its place. This is why the left likes to use intersectionality. It's a substitution of identity politics warfare for class warfare. Now, in order to make this work, they have to have a hierarchy, because not everyone can be equally victimized. So what they do is they break everybody down into groups, and they decide that your opinion is only valuable if you are a leftist member of these groups. And we can decide whether your opinion is more or less valuable depending on which group you belong to. So the hierarchy of victimhood goes something like this. If you're LGBT and Q, then we suggest that you are at the very top of the victimhood hierarchy. You have been most victimized in the United States, and therefore your opinion must be taken with the most gravitas. After that, we get to black folks. Black folks have been historically victimized in the United States, which of course is true, but the idea that every black person now is being individually victimized by the United States is not true. But they go back to the history, and then they say, okay, black people have been super victimized. That means if you're black, your opinion is worth more, and no one can challenge your politics without also challenging your identity. So it goes LGBTQ, and then black folks, and then Hispanic folks, and then women, and then Jews, and then Asians, and then way down at the bottom, white straight males. Right? Those are the people who are at the very bottom, and their opinions do not matter at all, because those are people who are beneficiaries of the system, right? They don't get to talk about the system, because they're the ones who built the system. They're the ones for whom the system was created. America was built in order to benefit rich, white, straight males, and ever since, it's been benefiting rich, white, straight males. And so they don't have anything to say until they acknowledge their white privilege. And if they do acknowledge their white privilege, they still can't say anything unless it's just mimicking what other people say. That's the best way to acknowledge white privilege. If you're a white ally, you'll shut the hell up. Right? That's the idea here. You can even see this. There's an Antifa video that was going around the internet over the past couple of weeks. It's really hilarious. It's a what appears to be a Latina Antifa woman talking to this gangly white Antifa nerd and telling him that he should shut up and punch a Nazi. He should not talk. He should just punch a Nazi. Because if he talks, then he's demonstrating his white privilege. But if he punches a Nazi, then he's a real ally. And that's how this logic goes. There's one problem with this. None of this is true. This notion of this hierarchy of victims, that everybody in the United States is treated by group identity by the system itself. Of course, I say this every speech, and people on the left constantly ignore it. Of course, American history is replete with racism and sexism and bigotry and homophobia. Of course that is true. And of course, some people are affected by the after effects of these things. Right? If you grew up in a community that suffered under Jim Crow, it's possible that you have less familial wealth passed down generation to generation. Of course that's true. You'd be a fool to deny that. That's not the same thing as saying that you get to affect injustice today in order to correct injustices in the past. You do not get to harm people who have never harmed you because somebody's dad once harmed your dad. That's not how justice works. That is injustice. And it's also not true, by the way, that America is a place where nobody can change their circumstance. America is a place where everybody can change their circumstance. This notion that America was created specifically for the benefit of rich white males to preserve their power. Absolute, utter hogwash. Just complete bull. The way that you know this is complete bull is because the highest single earning group, average family, is Asians. The Constitution, last I checked, was not written in Korean by a bunch of straight Korean males who wrote the Constitution specifically to preserve their own place at the top of the Asian-dominated American hierarchy. The fact is that there is tremendous mobility in American society. This is the American dream, is this mobility, and that still exists. So now I'm going to explain why, if you're a member of particular groups, you're not a victim. So I'm not just going to leave it at telling you you're not a victim. I'm going to explain why you're not a victim. Okay, let's start with black folks in the United States. Are you inherently victimized because you're black in the United States? So again, for the second time, slavery, Jim Crow, evil, no excuses. Of course. And of course those have historical after effects. That is not the same thing as saying that people who are living in bad circumstances today are doing so because the system today is unfair. That is not the same thing at all. I require that when I have a political conversation with somebody, that they prescribe a solution. Okay, it just can't be whining about the circumstances of America. I need a solution, because usually the whining doesn't even boil down to evidence. It boils down to America is racist, therefore support my program, and if you don't support my program, it's because you're a racist too. That's not an argument, that's an emotional appeal. And it's nasty and it's vicious, because the implication is that you're a racist if you disagree with them, which is garbage. So, let's talk about the income gap between black folks and white folks in the United States. Again, it is true. Familial wealth 2 generations ago, there was a big gap between black folks and white folks, and that gap exists today. Is that entirely due, or even largely due, or even mostly due to historic injustices, the lack of income mobility in large swaths of the black community? No, it isn't. Income mobility still exists. According to the Brookings Institute, a left-leaning institute, 2% of Americans who followed these 3 simple rules are in permanent poverty. Only 2%. The other 98% of Americans who follow these 3 simple rules will not live in permanent poverty in the United States. Get married before you have babies, finish high school, get a job. That's it. Those are the 3 simple rules. Okay, I don't think that it's asking too much to suggest that we are all capable of doing these things. High schools around the United States suck. If you can write your name, you're going to finish high school in the United States. Getting a job. Jobs are widely available. They may not be the kind of work you want to do. It may not be at the wage that you want to accept, but you can get a job. There are people out there who are seeking people to get jobs. And notice, the Brookings Institute doesn't say a job where you're happy and satisfied. It doesn't say you have to have a job as a beat poet. Right? It says that you have to get a job. If you hold down a job and you finish high school, and then finally, if you don't have a baby before you're married. And again, I think everyone is capable of this. It's so weird to me. People on the left, whenever I say this, they go, well, that's just discriminatory for you to say that people aren't capable of this. That's discriminatory. Just don't put that thing in that place without that thing on it. What is this? This is not difficult. 75% of Americans who have followed these 3 simple rules and started off in the lowest quintile in America's economy have moved into the middle class. 75%. Single motherhood is the single greatest predictor of intergenerational poverty, not race, not race. 71% of poor families in the United States overall have children without being married. The poverty rate among non-married white families was about 22% as of 2008. The poverty rate among black married couples, that same year, 7%. What happened to the white privilege? What happened to the white privilege? Why is it that white unmarried mothers aren't richer than black married families? Because the problem isn't the color, the problem is the lack of marriage, obviously. Okay, how about crime? There's this notion that the police are systemically racist. They're going around and just arresting black people willy-nilly so that they can fill the prisons with black people for no reason other than they hate black people. Okay, nonsense. Not true. Not true. You know what's a really easy way not to end up in jail? Do not commit a crime. Really easy way not to end up in jail. Statistically speaking, felonies are under-prosecuted in the black community. Police are less likely to kill black people than white people in similar shooting circumstances. As of this year, people who are talking about the police going out willy-nilly shooting people, kneeling in front of for the national anthem in front of the American flag because of the evil police, a protest that makes no sense on a variety of levels and is an insult to our troops and the memory of people who fought and died to defend that flag and that anthem. Notice I didn't say those people should be fired. I'm just saying they're morons. Okay, the fact is that according to the Washington Post, this is the Washington Post, okay, not a right-wing source. I try not to use right-wing sources so that people on the left can't accuse me of cherry-picking the data. According to the Washington Post, there have been 721 police shootings this year. Grand total number of black unarmed people shot by the police, 9. 9. Okay? Notice that is not 50%, that is not 40%, that is not 30%, that is not 10%, that is closer to 1%. Closer to 1%. And just because a perp is not armed, or a suspect is not armed, to be more specific, does not mean they didn't try to attack the police. Okay, you count as unarmed if you attack the police with your fists, and if you try to take the gun off the police officer. So the idea that even those 9 is all innocent people being shot is not true either. Right? This is why we need to look at each individual case. Instead of just saying that every case is a case of police racism, we actually need the evidence in each individual case. If you show me a case where it looks like a racist shooting, for example, the shooting of Walter Scott in South Carolina, where a white officer shoots a black guy in the back, if that happens, then you're talking about something that we can all get behind. But if you're talking about Darren Wilson shooting Michael Brown, absolutely not. That is not a racist shooting. And to do as President Obama did and pretend that rioting in Ferguson is somehow justified by a good police shooting, even according to witness testimony of black witnesses in Ferguson, Missouri, is absurd. Hey, here's the bottom line statistic here. Police are 18.5 times more likely to be shot by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be shot and killed by the police. Sorry, we've got to fix the mic here. Still out. Alrighty. Is it back on or just rolling? Okay, keep rolling. All right, fine. Okay, if you are a woman in the United States, you are also not a victim. His notion that women all over the United States are being raped and fired and brutalized, and it's just like the Taliban, and Donald Trump is somehow a peculiarly anti-woman force in legislation. All this is nonsense. Okay, here's the actual reality. First of all, let's start with the college rape statistics, because this is a big one on college campuses. There's this weird idea that's been floating around, promulgated by people in the Democratic Party, that 1 out of 5 women on a college campus is raped every year. Okay, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I can suggest, oh, there we go, okay, good. But I can suggest that this statistic is absolute hogwash. The statistic has no merit, the idea that 1 in 5 women on college campuses has been sexually assaulted or raped. Number one, if your parents, women in the audience, if your parents sent you to a campus where you had a 1 in 5 chance of being raped, you should sue them for child endangerment. Here are the actual statistics. This is from the Bureau of Justice Department statistics, the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Okay, here you go. College students are far less likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than their non-college peers. College campuses, in other words, are safer than a woman of the same age who's outside a college campus. Approximately 6.1 rapes per 1,000 females aged 18 to 24 on college campuses were reported by the BJS from 1997 to 2013. Okay, again, that's 6.1 in 1,000. What we are told by the media, what we are told by folks on the left, is that number is somewhere between 200 and 250 out of 1,000. The actual statistic is 6. Okay, that is not a college rape epidemic. And by the way, this is not making light of rape. As I always say, rapists should be castrated, imprisoned for life, or killed. How about this bizarre notion that women across the country are being victimized in their jobs, that they're not being paid enough? Okay, again, the statistics do not bear this out. There is no more debunked statistic in America today than the 73 cents on the dollar statistic. It is comparing apples and oranges. Men work different jobs, they work different hours, they have different lifestyles, they get different educational degrees. The idea that everybody is in the same jobs and women are just being paid less is not true. It's just not true. Okay, in fact, Time magazine reported in 2010 that in 147 out of 150 of the biggest cities in America, women make 8% more than men in their peer groups when they get out of college and don't have kids. More, okay? Women like to spend less time in the workforce because they like to have babies. This is not controversial, and this is not insulting. It's great that women like to have babies. If women didn't like to have babies, there would be no future generations. Okay? It is. I'm constant. I have to say, as a father of 2, under 4, and my wife is a doctor, so she's a very high-achieving woman, right? She's in medical residency right now. This idea that women should somehow not like having babies, or we have to make fun of them for being homemakers, or it's a bad thing, or they're not fulfilling their destinies by having babies, it's tripe. It's tripe. I mean, and it is also tripe that men and women should or want to spend the same amount of time out of the workforce taking care of babies. It's just not the reality. It's not the reality. When my wife had our first kid, she took off a year. When we had our first kid, I took off 3 days. Okay, that's not unusual. That's not unusual, and it makes some sense. I mean, I don't have to nurse the kid, right? She had to nurse the baby, and guess what? She liked it. She was sad when she went back to work. Now, it's anecdotal, but the fact is that every study ever done shows that women want to take more time off from work than men do. When my wife finishes working, she may want to work part-time. I don't want to work part-time. Okay, that's very typical. Men like working different hours. Men work more hours. If a woman has a choice, on average, between going to an activity that involves her child and working the extra 3 hours at the office to get those billables up, the woman will go hang out with the child. Okay, that's not a slur. It's not a slander. Sociological data show this. Okay, this is what the data show. It's not a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing. Men and women are not the same. Men and women are different. These are things we should celebrate. Women have a superpower. They get to create other humans. That's an incredible thing. Why are we ripping on this? Okay, how about the notion across the country that LGBT people are being persecuted across the country, that they are living just a horrific lifestyle in fear for their lives above somebody's attic like Anne Frank? Okay, this is not true either. Women in lesbian couples make far more money than women in straight couples. Men in gay couples make slightly less money than men in straight couples, but same-sex couples with both partners in the labor force make $8,000 more per year on average than straight couples. They're also typically higher educated. As far as the notion that hate crime statistics show this wild upsurge in the amounts of hate crime against gay people, the hate crime statistics also tend to show that there's a huge amount of hate crime, for whatever hate crime is defined as, against Jews. This is the greatest country in world history for Jews. Okay, the statistics show that the rates are actually pretty similar for hate crimes against gay people. Every single hate crime should be prosecuted against a gay person. Every single one of them. Just as they should against Jews or black people or anybody else. But this idea that gay people are walking around living in brutal fear in America today, it's just not the reality. It's just not the reality. And by the way, as for the notion that you're a victim, in any sense, because you walk into a place and you say, I want you to cater my same-sex wedding, and therefore you're victimized by American society if the religious store owner says no, you're not a victim because that person has no duty to serve you. Just as the gay baker has no duty to serve the Westboro Baptist Church annual function. Okay, it's a free country. You get to serve whoever you want. And guess what? Guess what? If someone discriminates against you, there's another bakery right across the street. Take your business there, and you can put the other bakery out of business. This is not difficult. And there's this great myth that flies around in left-wing circles that if it hadn't been for the federal government, discrimination never would have ended on the private level in the United States. That's not true. You know what kept discrimination in place on the private level in the United States? Government. Jim Crow is a system of law. Jim Crow is a system of law in places like Alabama and South Carolina and Mississippi, where they legitimately prosecuted businesses, put them in jail for desegregating. That's what kept segregation in place. Markets free people from discrimination because the only color that matters is green. Okay. Finally, there's this notion in America that if you're poor, that you're a victim in American society. This is the Bernie Sanders stupidity, that there's the 1% versus the 99%, and everyone in the 1% is taking advantage of all the people in the 99%, and please, where did I put my pudding? Again, the statistics do not bear this out. The idea that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer ignores how statistics work. People in the top 1% 10 years ago are not in the top 1% now. People in the top 1% now may not be in the top 1% in the future. Your income is going to change year to year. Some of you, many of you, will eventually be in the top 1%. You aren't right now. Are you a 1%er or no? You're not, right now you're not, because you're not, right? I mean, the bottom line is 1% just measures the level of income. It doesn't follow the people who are in the top 1%. People move up and down on the income scale. Right now you have no money because you're broke college students spending all your money on pot. But in the future, you will presumably be the heads of companies, God help us, and then you will be providing goods and services to the rest of us that earn you lots of money, and good for you. And this idea that you are somehow hurting people by earning money in a free market system is insane. Okay, Bill Gates has done more to bring the world out of poverty than Mother Teresa did through free market economics. The reason being he created legitimately tens of thousands of jobs. He made better products for people that made their jobs more efficient. Okay, capitalism brings people out of poverty. Legitimately, half of the world has been brought out of abject poverty by free markets and free trade. In the United States, the upper middle class grew from 12% of Americans in 1979 to 30% as of 2014. So this idea the middle class is falling apart, it's not true. Most of the people in the middle class are now in the upper middle class. Everyone's life is getting better, and if your life is getting better more slowly than Bill Gates, how does that hurt you? Your life is still getting better. Okay, if you live next door to Bill Gates, you're still doing fine, even though your house doesn't look like his. Almost 9 in 10 Americans have a standard of living above the global middle income standard. We're the richest, most prosperous country in the history of the world. And as for the notion that the rich people aren't paying their fair share, again, the statistics do not bear this out. If you are in the top quintile of income earners, you pay, after we take into account the kickbacks that everybody gets from the federal government, the various benefits and checks that are sent to you, if you're in the top quintile of income earners in the United States, you are literally footing the bill for 85% of all non-mandatory federal spending. Okay, if you're in the top 20% of income earners, 85% of net federal revenue is coming from you. The people at the top are paying not some of the taxes, not most of the taxes, virtually all of the federal income tax in the United States. So this idea that they are somehow screwing everybody else over, I promise you, when people like me sign 6-figure checks to the government every year, that I'm not screwing anybody, I'm the one who's getting screwed, okay? So bottom line, for people who find this speech depressing, let me suggest that you need a mind shift. You need to change your worldview. This speech should be uplifting because it says that you get to do what you want, which was the basic American promise in the first place. You get to do what you want. And again, as I've said now for the third time, if somebody is victimizing you in a specific way due to racism, sexism, bigotry, then name it, call it out, and we can all be a part of fighting that together. But otherwise, buckle down, do your work. The way your life is going to get better is by you working harder and working smarter and making smart decisions. Your decisions are the best privilege that you have. The only privilege that matters in the United States is the privilege of making free decisions. We all have that privilege in a free country. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. Alrighty. So, now for everybody's favorite part, the Q&A. So, as always, we have a standing rule. If you're one of the brave liberals or leftists who came out to hear me, and I appreciate it, and you want to ask a question, raise your hand, you go to the front of the line. People who disagree always go to the front of the line. That's the standing rule. So. So I think that value to the society, we have to define value. So if it reduces, for example, the amount of promiscuity, then sure, that's a value to society. Right? Less promiscuity means generally less sexually transmitted disease, so that would be a value to society. But that is not a value that you can necessarily measure within marriage because there are many different types of marriage, unfortunately, and monogamy is not always the way that marriage is run. Ask Dan Savage. So, as far as gay marriage providing a benefit to the state, the only benefit that I can see is if presumably you can make maybe an argument that people who are locked into a monogamous relationship are more likely to be solid citizens, basically, less likely to sleep around, less likely to be profligate with their money because they're saving up for things. And maybe that's a benefit for society, sure. But the chief benefit of marriage was never about locking a man to a woman. I mean, the chief benefit of marriage, which is why I believe that the state really, if it has any stake in marriage at all, has a stake in traditional marriage. The chief benefit of marriage, always and for all of history, was the production and rearing of children, which is not something that gay couples can do naturally, obviously, for obvious biological reasons. So that's why there is a valuable distinction between straight marriage and gay marriage. But my perspective on gay marriage, as you allude to it, is that the government should get completely out of this business because, number one, the government is terrible at actually making marriage something worthwhile. I mean, it's failed at that dramatically. And number two, because the federal government, once we start enshrining gay marriage alongside straight marriage, the next step is going to be for states to use anti-discrimination law to crack down on religious institutions. And that's something that I fear is going to seriously encroach on religious freedom. So it seems to me that the best solution is for everybody just to go back to their respective churches and do what you want.
So, other than the one that you said, instead of catching on promiscuity, you do not see any other value.
No, I mentioned another one, which would presumably be that you're more likely to save up for a house or something. Like financial responsibility in monogamous relationships tends to be higher than for people who are promiscuous, for example.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Sure.
Hello? Okay, cool. Thank you, Tom. All right. Hey, huge fan. I actually really agree with you a lot more than I disagree with. It tends to be a thing among reasonable people. So,
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, my question that I have for you essentially stems from an article that you've written, essentially why atheism is morally bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, you essentially say, essentially without God, we can't really have morality, or without a soul, we can't really have choice. But you seem to be presuming that the existence of a soul and the existence of God kind of baselessly. Do you have any justification or evidence for those presumptions?
Sure. So the existence of, so I'm going to make now an Aristotelian/Aquinas argument for the existence of God. So the basic idea, and I'm going to try and boil this down so that it makes some sense. The basic Aristotelian argument for the existence of an unmoved mover is the idea that there are a bunch of, every object around you has actual and potential, right? It has an actuality and it has a potential. So if you have a candle and it's made of wax, it has the potential to be a pool of wax, but that potential is not fulfilled unless something acts upon it. The only thing that can act upon an object and make it fulfill its potential is either another object that has its own potential or something that is pure actuality, right? It does not have any potential. It's just actual. It just exists, right? So the idea in the Aristotelian argument for God is that if you don't want an infinite regress of causes, if you don't want an infinite regress of things that have actuality and potential, and then something has to actualize it, and something has to actualize it, and something has to actualize it, you have to come to the unactualized actualizer, right? A thing that just is, right? A thing that just exists, and as Aquinas says, this is what we call God, right? This thing that exists and has the capacity to actualize the potential of other objects. And so this is his argument for the existence of God, that otherwise you get an infinite regress, and there need not be an infinite regress of causes. Now, this is a basic Aristotelian argument, as I say, that is shaped by Aquinas. There are other good arguments about this. One is based on the principle of sufficient reason, this idea that we have the capacity to understand the universe. So if you believe that you have the capacity to understand the universe, which most scientists and atheists believe, that we have the capacity to understand the universe, are there limitations to that capacity? So the principle of sufficient reason suggests there are no limitations, we just don't have enough information, but if given proper information, we can understand every aspect of the universe. If that's the case, then you have to ask, okay, that creates a system where, to understand things, things are contingent on one another, right? If a baseball hits a window, that's contingent on me hitting the baseball. So again, and this is true for every scientific law, laws of nature, right? If there's a law of gravity, then we try and discover why is there that law of gravity? Where did that come from? And so the idea is that if you're a believer that we have the capacity to understand all of these things and that we have the sufficient reason to understand the universe, then there has to be something outside the system of contingencies that got the ball rolling in the first place, right? A timeless being that is pure existence. Again, it's a very similar argument. A timeless being, it has to exist outside of time because otherwise it would be fulfilling a potential. Things inside time always have a potential to be fulfilled, but things outside of time don't have a potential to be fulfilled. So I've described to you a being that has pure existence, that exists outside of time, and that has the potential to actualize anything. That's God. So that's the argument in favor of God. Now, you don't have to buy it, but that's the evidence-based argument in favor of God. The problem that I have with scientific materialism is that all of human society is based on notions that are directly contrary to scientific materialism. And the reason that I say that atheism is not a good basis for a moral system is that atheism is not the basis for any moral system. There's no guiding principle. Right? I can make an equally valid argument on one side or another based on a system where there is no God, and not only no God, no being that created the universe in order to perform certain functions. So if you read Aristotle, what Aristotle says is that human beings were created to perform a certain function. Sorry, long-winded answer. That human beings were created to perform a certain function. That function was to reason, right? This is Aristotle's idea. And so every object was created to perform a certain function. If you don't believe that, if you believe that everything arose spontaneously or randomly, that just came about through pure chance, then you can't say that there is an is-ought gap that David Hume points out that is unbridgeable. You can't get from is to ought, and you have to make up your own moralities. That's the basic argument.
Okay. I actually agree with you with a lot of that, right? I don't think atheism is a point that we can really build off.
I'm not saying, by the way, that atheists can't be moral people. They absolutely can, of course.
I'm not saying you are.
Yeah.
I simply, so how did you rule out, though, a naturalistic explanation, though, for the existence of reality? Because it kind of sounds like a God of the gaps argument, right? Where it's like, we're an argument from incredulity, right? So essentially, I can't think of a better argument, therefore my argument, or therefore God.
No, I don't think that that's right. I think that the God of the gaps would say, things I don't know, I'm going to attribute to God. I'm saying that in order for anything to be actualized, there has to be something, and this is a basic principle.
Okay, thank you. Just really quick with that point and stuff. So if you're not familiar with like theoretical physicists, or particle physicists,
yes.
like Tom Carroll and Lawrence
Mm-hmm.
Krauss, right, where essentially
They say things kind of wink and blink out of existence, yes.
Yeah, with essentially things function different on a quantum level, right? So we live in a realm of Newtonian physics,
Right.
So different, essentially, realm of domain of applicability is.
Yes. No, I understand this argument, yeah. So the Aristotelian Aquinas answer to that would be, you're still suggesting that there's a system in which that happens. Where does that system come from?
Okay, yeah,
Because otherwise you end up, basically you end up with three final analyses of the possibilities of the universe. One is the unmoved mover, one is an infinite regress of causes, and one is the brute fact, the kind of Bertrand Russell argument that there are just brute facts to the universe and we can't understand them. Well, that doesn't really explain anything, the brute fact thing, right? That is a God of the gaps argument, right? That's saying we can't explain it, so it's a brute fact, we're done. That's the same thing as a God of the gaps argument. Cool, thank you. By the way, I want to thank Edward Fieser, who's the author of some books that talk specifically about a lot of those arguments.
Hey, Ben. So I've seen a lot of your videos, and I just had a couple quick questions about education.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just start out. Like, where do you stand on it? Where would you like to see it in 50 or 100 years?
Well, I think that education needs to get back to a perspective where we are training people for actual activities rather than training people for whining outside this lecture hall. You'll find this out when you enter the workforce, but the best training for any job is actually just being on the job. And there's this weird idea that you can do job training in college. You can get a basic skill set that may be applicable to a job, but the best way to do a job is just to get a job. So I'm very much in line with Peter Thiel's argument that there's a good argument that you should probably, like, if you don't actually have a plan for what you're doing with your education, and you're just going to college in order to go to your gender studies course and then have no job afterward, then you might be better off taking that money and pouring it into something more productive.
So, like, what steps would you personally like to see implemented into not just college, but high school and...
Okay, so I'll start with college, and I'm gonna say something deeply unpopular. I do not think the government should be in the business of student loans.
Yes.
The reason I say this is because the government is not answerable to anybody. It's just a giant money bag, and they have an interest in providing student loans to anyone who will take it because now you're dependent on the government and you like the government. When it comes to private loans, I'll give you an example. When it comes to my wife's medical school education, we took out a bunch of private loans. Or we didn't have to, but we could have. If we had done that, we would have gotten loans up the wazoo. She's going to be a doctor. She'll pay it back. Better example is Harvard Law. I had big loans from private institutions for Harvard Law. Did I have trouble getting a loan? Of course not. They knew that I'd be making six figures coming out of Harvard Law. Now, if I wanted to major in lesbian dance theory, would I have been able to get an actual loan from an actual bank? No, because the loan officer would look at me and say, how in the world are we going to pay this off? I mean, we can't repossess your lesbian dance theory degree. So what exactly do we do here? So privatizing student loans would do a lot to actually inject a measure of rationality and forward thinking into college. As far as high school and elementary school, we need to go back to a standards-based curriculum, and we need to go back to localism, because the people who care most about their kids' education are still the parents. This notion... There's this idea that if we just pour money into schools, that suddenly that's going to fix all the public schools, it'll fix elementary, it'll fix middle, it'll fix high school. The fact is that good schools start with parents who care enough about their children's education to get involved and make sure that their kids are getting a good education. So I am for things like vouchers, and I am for freedom and educational choice, and I am for localism, but it all starts at home. And I think that if you really want to fix the educational system, you have to start with the idea that the schools are not responsible for your kids' education in the main. You are responsible for your kids' education in the main. What was that? Oh, you want to shake hands? Yeah, sure. Here, come on.
For many people, we're nearing a point of no return towards a permanent tyrannical, out-of-control government. Short of another civil war, what are at least two specific things embracers of natural rights, liberty, and economic freedom can do to actually get the pendulum to swing the other way and recapture the moral high ground in the current cultural, political, and economic environment?
So I think the first thing that people who want freedom need to do is they need to start speaking the language of morality. The biggest mistake that people on the right make is they make efficiency arguments. Right? They say socialism is bad because it doesn't work, because it makes people poor. No, socialism is bad because it's a crappy idea that steals money from some people and gives it to others based on jealousy. Right? If you make a moral argument, people are more likely to engage, because everybody has a basic moral sense that stealing is wrong, but people may not care that efficiency doesn't work. And so conservatives need to start talking moral sense again. Natural rights is based entirely on right and wrong. We have to get back to discussing in exactly that way. That's the first thing. The second is that we have to get politically involved. We have to run for office. We have to get involved in local office. And we also have to get involved in the culture. Because culture shapes how people think. Hollywood shapes how people think. You know, I don't like what's going on with the NFL right now. Because I think that it's actually taking away a cultural space. I think the left started it and Trump has actually made it worse. I think it's taking away a common cultural space that we needed to be free of politics and made it worse. I think Kaepernick started it. Actually, it started before that. It started with the hands up, don't shoot nonsense from the St. Louis Rams in 2014. But the taking away of common cultural spaces is a problem, but the right needs to start moving into cultural spaces and telling our stories on a way that appeals to emotions. So as you know, my slogan is facts don't care about your feelings, but people are still driven by feelings when they analyze the facts. And that's why we have to speak in language that people understand.
And I appreciate that response. As a follow-up, what are your personal views on Article 5 Convention of States?
I've endorsed that. I came out actually today I endorsed that. So I'm in favor of the Article 5 Convention of States. Yeah. So yeah, I'm in favor of that. Well, thank you for coming to this Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
My question for you, the other atheists might ask my question a little bit.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, I watched, obviously, your videos so much that I think my girlfriend usually started a lot. I've noticed in my video, I feel like you straw man a lot of atheist arguments. I was wondering, can you give me your actual definition of atheism? Because I saw the conversation you had with Mr. Prager.
Yes.
Can you expand on that a little bit for me?
Sure. I mean, it would be more fun if you'd give me your definition of atheism, and then we could talk about it. Because, yeah, why don't we start with that?
So I understand the dictionary definition of atheism is just something.
There is no God, yeah.
Right. But I think it's a little bit deeper than that. And out of many atheists that I've talked to, I've never met a single one that says they have empirical knowledge that God doesn't exist. And I feel like that's the argument they're making. I could be wrong. I don't think
Well, to me, that was the difference definitionally between agnostics and atheists. Right. So if you want to say that, if we want to talk about agnosticism and say maybe God exists, maybe doesn't, but I don't have evidence of it, so I don't believe. That's borderline agnostic atheist. That's fine. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, to my central argument, whether you're an agnostic or an atheist, the bottom line is that without the belief that there is a purpose to the universe, without a belief that there is a purpose to your life, without a belief that you have the capacity to make individual choices, it's very difficult to build a civilization. By difficult, I mean impossible.
so on that note of free will, which is what you're talking about.
Yes. I think free will, by the way, is the single most important principle undergirding any civilization. Yeah. But in your own life, you're not, because you chose to come here and you chose to ask me a question, right? I would hate to think that the universe randomly imbued you with a set of atoms that showed up here randomly to ask me a question. That would be very disappointing to me. Oh, yeah, no, we're scheduling it right now. Actually, one of the things that we're talking about doing is he invited me, and I have just, if it fits with the schedule, to do actually a live podcast with him at a forum in San Francisco, like a couple thousand people. Yeah, actually, I was at a dinner with Sam Harris about 3 weeks ago, and we had this conversation for 3 hours. Yeah, so I think Sam's an intelligent guy. I think he has some good arguments. I think that, let's put it this way, it's harder to argue for either atheism or religion than it is to argue against either atheism or religion. It's very easy to argue against religion, and it's very easy to argue against atheism. It's particularly easy, I think, to argue against atheism in the sense that atheism is not useful. I mean, from a pragmatist viewpoint, atheism undercuts a lot of the central premises that you need in order to have relationships with other people. If you believe that everything is random, that the only thing that matters is the essentially natural selection of which you are not in any control, then it's very difficult to create a purposeful life, and people find happiness in purpose, is the short argument. Thanks so much. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Still waiting for your president of Canada to see when you hopefully one day. But no, one of the things that I love that
I may have a shot in Utah. I think I'd have some trouble in California. Thank you.
And so I just have a quick question about that. Is in the book of Isaiah, in chapter 5, Isaiah talks about that there will be a time where people will call good evil and evil good,
Mhm.
dark light and light dark. Is that what you believe is happening right now? And if so, what advice would you give to someone in college who 90, or I don't know the exact statistic, but a majority of the professors are liberal and can essentially affect your grade, and you're basically just told to keep your mouth shut unless you agree with it?
So I think throughout history there have been people who called light dark and dark light, and I think there's certainly a large contingent of people in the United States who do that now, who don't speak the language of logic, who invert language to say things like speech is violence, right? I mean, I think these are, or man is a woman and a woman is a man. Like these are things that do not have linguistic meaning, right? This is foolish. But as far as what you can do in class, so I'm a pragmatist about this, and that is every conversation should have a purpose, and every attempt to speak out in class should have a purpose. So you need to weigh the consequences of what you're going to do. There are some professors who are wonderful and perfectly open about hearing dissenting points of view. When I was at Harvard Law School, one of those professors for me was a woman named Lonnie Guinier, who I believe was nominated for Undersecretary of Labor under President Clinton and was so radical to the left that she was rejected by a Democratic Senate. She and I got along famously. She ended up writing me a recommendation for my law firm job. So I think there are people on the left who are like this and love hearing arguments and enjoy it. And those are the people that you treasure when you find them because it's fun and it's interesting. And sometimes you change your mind. But I think that if it's a professor who's going to grade you down, your best option is not to leave your future in their hands. So just talk to students outside of class. Talk to other people outside of class. Write what the professor wants to hear in the blue books. I graduated summa cum laude from UCLA. The way I did that is I would speak out in class, but we had blue books. The blue books were all anonymous. So in class I would talk like Milton Friedman, and in the blue books I'd talk like Bernie Sanders. It's A+, man. So I mean, that's it. I love you too, man. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for helping put my children through college. I appreciate that.
So I do disagree with you on weakness, though. You said on your show a couple of times your opinion on Dreamers.
Yes.
Trying to this. How it's a bad argument to say these people are here through no fault of their own.
Yes.
And I've spent the past little while trying to frame the questions. I didn't hear your comments last week. Last week, when you were at Berkeley, you had someone ask you a question about abortion, and you said that mothers who are getting an abortion cannot be prosecuted for that because they don't have a criminal intent on this radar.
Yes.
You've also said in a bunch of your videos that children are incapable of consent. Wouldn't that also mean that they're incapable of mens rea?
Yes, so they are incapable of mens rea, but the crime of illegal immigration is not one that requires intent. So there's certain crimes that are strict liability and certain crimes that require intent. So, for example, if a crime that requires intent is murder. Murder requires intent. First-degree murder requires intent. If I trespass on your property, that is not necessarily a crime that requires intent. Or if I accidentally stumble on your property, I don't necessarily have to have had intent to stumble on your property for the police to prosecute me for trespass. Right, because that's a strict liability crime. There are certain crimes that are like that. Illegal immigration is one such crime. Now, the argument that I've made on Dreamers is that I don't think all Dreamers should be deported. I think that we should analyze whether someone should be deported not based on the circumstances why they're in the country, but on the benefit they can provide to the country. So we should analyze people on a one-to-one basis. Meaning, are you a person who is here being productive, contributing to the country? Are you part of the American dream? Stay. If you're not, get out. Right, and that's how I feel about any choice that we can make about people, whether we're bringing people in legally or whether we're determining what to do with people who are already here illegally. That seems to me the same standard. If you're here illegally, you should go to the back of the line and wait behind the people who came here legally.
And then my follow-up question to that is, what would you have these people who are in this situation actually do to show to the United States government that they're willing to be responsible potential citizens?
So I think that your life record tends to show it. So the DREAM Act, or what would be the DREAM Act, applies to people who are between the ages of 16 and 31 as of 2012, I believe. So that means that all those people are now above the age of 21. right? That class of dreamers, because I think that did it close? I think it may just be closing now. It's possible that Trump closed it now, so I don't want to get the facts wrong here. But the bottom line is that the majority, the bulk of the people who are dreamers are now of majority age, right? They're not between 16 and 18, they're above the age of 18. That means that you've had some track record to show whether, at the very least, you're not going to be damaging to society. So you haven't committed a crime, you're not on welfare, you're not on food stamps, you're not living on the streets, right? You have a job, you're trying to hold down the job, you've gone to college, you've served in the military, right? It's an obvious example. So I think there are certain criteria that are pretty objective that we could use on that score. Sure. Hey, how are you?
I enjoy watching your videos where you people are crazy. So I want to understand your position on transgender people better.
Sure.
So, as you're probably aware, the genitals and the brain form in separate stages, and based on the amount of hormones, which is usually triggered by the chromosomes that are produced to the genitals, it's either male or female.
Right.
Whether or not that is also, since the brain is in a separate phase, it's possible for them to influence that, but it's also possible that it may not be. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, there's been some studies, like Lily Becker did one, where they injected female biological rats with testosterone in the brain, and just during the brain stage, and these rats, started to help their transgender, but
Right.
at least lesbians on the transgender side.
Okay.
So there's some indication of hormones being influenced there. So my question for you is, if hypothetically you had a male brain that was put in a female body, what pronouns would you use for this person?
First of all, I think that we'd have to have better science determining what constitutes a quote-unquote female brain versus a male brain, because brain science is really underdeveloped in this particular area. But assuming in the future that they come up with a strict definition, which I think is rather unlikely. But let's assume you're hypothetical, because it's a fun hypothetical. So they somehow create a brain swapping mechanism, and Kylie Jenner's brain ends up in Caitlyn Jenner's body, right? Okay, or body 3 years ago. That's the hypothetical. The answer there is that I think that a more technical definition would probably be that the person is intersex, because now you're looking at a person who has a biological basis for their intersex behavior, right? They have genitals of one type, and they have a biology that dictates that their brain is functioning in another way. But to suggest that they're a full-fledged woman is not the case, because chromosomes still determine how your sex develops. The strict biological definition is strictly chromosomal based. I mean, if you talk to a doctor or a scientist and you say, is this person male or female, they'll give you a blood test, they'll look at your chromosomes, and they will say this person is male or female. If you're talking about something else, then you could be talking about somebody who's intersex. The argument that it seems to me a lot of transgender folks are making is not that they actually have to demonstrate anything objectively verifiable in order to claim transgenderism. And this is where you run into some problems, right? Not that we run a brain scan and we determine that you have a brain that looks more like a female brain than a male brain, but that without running a brain scan, if you claim or if you think that you're a member of the other sex, we now invariably have to call you a member of the other sex. That is an argument that proves way too much and is far too malleable for me. So if you want to create a separate set of pronouns that apply to people who have this hypothetical problem that you're talking about, I'm fine with this extra set of pronouns that you want to talk about, but I'm not comfortable with saying that a biological male is a she, because a biological male is not a she, a biological male is a he.
Yeah, I saw your interview where the person that put their hands on your neck. I agree that there are cases.
Yeah, that was a little bit over the top. That night did not go as I'd planned. I mean, at least ask me on a date first. That was And I also, quick other note, I think that one of the problems here is that people, when they talk about, gendered brain, for example, this is why I keep saying we need some sort of objective test if we're going to talk about this, like an objectively verifiable test that you can look at a brain scan or something. Because otherwise, you get really quickly into very anti-feminist things, like it's a male, but he's a very effeminate male, right? They'll say things like this, right? They'll say his gender is female because he's very effeminate. Well, that's actually really stereotypical. Well, he likes cooking and sewing and stuff. Like that seems kind of like feminists might have a problem with that.
Are you aware that I actually have done a lot of
So there are two problems with these brain scan studies, which I have seen. So the brain scan study, the first problem is that they are very, very small sample size, and also they're self-selected. So you have a bunch of people coming in and saying, I'm transgender, scan my brain. You can't do a study that way. What you have to do is you have to take a cross-section of people. You have to have a control group. You have to have a cross-section of people who are not transgendered also, and and then you need to see, okay, if there's somebody in the non-transgender community who has the same brain scan but is not transgender, that sort of debunks the argument. And they haven't really done that. Well, if you have the study, send it to me, and I'm happy to take a look at it. That's fine. I'm happy to take a look at it. The sample sizes are incredibly small. And finally, brain scans, as I say, they need to get a lot more sophisticated before I'm willing to buy this argument, because brain scans are notoriously difficult to... My wife being a doctor, we talk about this kind of stuff a lot. And brain scans, I mean, they still are trying to figure out the particular function of parts of the brain. So the idea that female biology comes down to a random part of the brain that we haven't even identified what it does yet, I mean, this is why brain surgery is so difficult. This is so. If it develops, as the science develops, I'm willing to hear arguments about using a new set of pronouns to address people who have an objectively verifiable brain scan, for example. But I'm not willing to hear that Caitlyn Jenner, who spent his entire life as Bruce Jenner, is now a woman, without any further evidence other than Caitlyn Jenner saying he is a woman. That's not correct. And by the way, even if he had a brain scan that said differently, he'd still be a man with this particular problem. He'd be a biological man with a female brain, if your hypothetical is true. And let's be specific about our language. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Howdy. I'm sorry? I've been encouraged by my producer Mathis here to watch Rick and Morty, but I have not yet seen Rick and Morty. That's what I'm hearing, yeah. Solid question, dude. It's going okay. How are you?
So I watched your video with Bruce Morgan, and I said I had some question on this question on that. In that interview, you said that your rationale for why civilians have the right to own assault rifles was, quote, the basis of the Second Amendment is not really about self-defense, and it's not about hunting, it's about resistance to government tyranny. That's what the founders said, and that's what the right is in this country. My question is this: do you really believe that in this day and age, that a portion of the U.S. population with assault rifles would be an adequate method to resist government tyranny when the government has access to unmanned drones, laser-guided missiles, nuclear weapons, and far superior weaponry? And if the answer to that question is no, then why should assault rifles be the weapon of choice for mass shootings be allowed in the United States?
Right. Okay. So number one, the idea that assault rifles are responsible for the vast majority of shootings. Whenever people argue against assault rifles, they like to talk about mass shootings because they use a very small set of all shootings to argue against assault rifles. The vast majority of gun-involved deaths involve handguns, and the left is uncomfortable with arguing that we should ban handguns, so instead they pick a very small subset like mass shootings, and then they say, let's ban the ARs. Okay, so that's number one. As far as the question as to whether a population armed with ARs could fight off the U.S. military, the answer is that, God forbid this should ever have to be the situation. God forbid, God forbid. But the answer is yes. I mean, have you been to Utah or Texas? The answer is yes. And the reason the answer and the reason that, I mean, imagine if the federal government tried to go to Texas and confiscate the guns. I mean, that would not go well. But the reason that I say this is because insurgencies all over the world routinely fight off larger and more well-equipped armies and create intense struggles for those armies, including the most powerful army in the history of humanity, the United States military, with significantly inferior weaponry. So when you're talking about a country of 330 million people, where there are 100 million guns in this country, 100 million, right? The active duty members of the U.S. military, it's like 2 million active duty members of the U.S. military. And I don't want to argue in favor of a tactical, in favor of how this would go. But the military minds that I've talked to, including people who have gone to the War College, say that, the idea that the U.S. government would immediately overrun all civilian areas and take away all the guns seems to me a little bit optimistic. Again, this is why we need to have a civilized republic, because God forbid it should ever come to this point. But the idea that it will never come to this point to take away all the guns, I think, has been belied by virtually every democracy in the Western Hemisphere at some point or another. Howdy. Sounds good.
One is, I'm a Vidme student. I am a student. And I just want to know, I know that you are not a fan of socialized healthcare or the single-payer system. But I'm curious to know if you think that the healthcare system as it is now needs any changes. And if so, what changes?
It needs wild deregulation. So the healthcare system that is currently built in a wide variety of areas. First of all, we do need to disconnect and work to disconnect employer-based health insurance, right? You need to buy individual health insurance. Basically, everyone should be on the individual market, and health insurance companies should be competing for your business, and you should voluntarily form associations to buy health care with your church or your synagogue or your friends in order so that you can take care of sick people. The problem with employer-based health insurance is that it disconnects you from the actual cost of the health insurance. You don't know how much your insurance costs. You don't know how much your doctor costs. If you walked into your doctor's office today and asked how much for an x-ray, the doctor can't tell you. The doctor has different rates for different insurance companies and different rates for individuals than for insurance companies. That means it's very hard to develop competition, open competition in the marketplace. When you do have open competition in the marketplace, you get better service, just like everything else, better service for lower cost. The evidence being the laser eye surgery industry. That industry had gone from $20,000 an eye like 10 years ago to like $3,000 an eye now, and it's much better because it's deregulated, insurance companies don't cover it, and people pay cash. Right, so whenever there's competition, then you get cheaper health insurance and more people, cheaper health care, and this holds for health insurance too, and that allows more doctors to go into that business. This is why doctors now want to be ophthalmologists, right? Or optometrists. So the idea of deregulating that aspect of the marketplace is useful. Deregulating health care across state lines would be another easy one. Preventing, I think, loosening state licensing for medicine. I think would help. It's basically a cartel. The idea that you have to be a doctor in order to draw blood or take particular tests, I think, is ridiculous. And the fact is that nurses are doing most of this stuff anyway. So, my wife works in hospitals. I keep referring to her because I love her and she's amazing. But not just because she works with nurses all the time. And this is where we're moving anyway, right? Regardless, nurse practitioners are taking over more and more of this stuff. But it's ridiculous that you should have to pay $100 to see a doctor to prescribe you Tamiflu, right? That's silly. It's silly. So I think that we have to deregulate a lot of those sorts of things. More competition. The real question is not how do you bring down the price of healthcare. That's pretty easy because it's the same answer there as it is everywhere else. The real question is what do you do with the people who didn't buy healthcare and now they're 70 years old and they're sick, right? That's always the hard question. And the answer is that this is where social institutions are so important. This is where churches and synagogues come in. This is why we give charity, right? This is why we have to work with our fellow man. This is why, even atheists should be very much in favor of churches and synagogues that take care of all of these people who wouldn't be able to take care of themselves on their own. And if churches and synagogues won't do it, then you can have a baseline system where, these people are put into a high-risk pool, for example. But you'd have to make sure that you don't actually undercut the incentive for young people to buy health insurance. Because if you have this backstop, then people will rely on the backstop. That's the way to bring down costs. The real question is, how do you increase the supply of doctors? Everybody talks about bringing down costs. How do you increase the supply of doctors? The answer is more competition. They get paid more. There's less red tape. There's less regulation. They see more patients. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
So I'm a teacher, elementary education teacher, and one big worry that I have is how am I supposed to provide, so I'm sure you can agree with me on this, that teachers are more undervalued and underpaid them for the work they do. Like, I feel like that's a fair statement.
It depends on the teacher and the work they do.
I definitely think that there are some teachers that...
There are some who are underpaid, wildly underpaid, sure. And there's some who ought to be fired. No, it's fine. Sorry, go ahead. Right. So, as I say, the reason that I go back to parents is because there have been many poor communities in the United States who have focused significant effort into making sure that their kids were provided resources to go to school, like working extra hours, making sure that their kids had what they need. It starts with the parents at home. It can't start with taxpayer dollars, because then again you get a big disconnect between what teachers actually need and what they get from the government, because they are paying union employees. There's a lot of wasted space in the middle. The money doesn't always get to the classroom. I mean, there's a lot of money being poured in education. Most of it never sees the classroom, or at least a huge percentage of it never sees the classroom. There needs to be more direct parent-to-teacher relationship, and I don't just mean PTA meetings. I mean like the parents actually saying, here are the resources I'm going to dedicate to the education of my child. I think that we're very unfair to our teachers, because we basically drop our kids off at school and say, give me back an educated child. And I think that if you're not willing to do the work at home, or to work with the teacher to make sure the teacher has the resources they need, then you're going to have a problem. Now, the truth is that the sort of educational resources, I mean, are we talking about desks and books, or are we talking about, other sorts of utilities? When it comes to payment of teachers, I do not think that there should be a unionized teaching system where teachers are graded by the amount of time they've been in the workplace rather than by quality or by the difficulty of their job. I think that if you're a really good teacher and you're teaching in a really hard situation, you'd be paid $100,000 a year. And I think if you're a crappy teacher, then you should be fired. And so a lot of the impediments to better education are coming via union rules that are mandating that we can't actually reward teachers consummate with their skill, or have consequences for teachers consummate with their lack thereof. But I think that, again, if you look at the communities in the United States that have started off very poor and become very wealthy on an average family level, if we're going to talk about like ethnic groups, you talk specifically here probably about Asian Americans and Jews. These would be groups where parents poured inordinate amount of time and energy into the education of their children, and it really didn't come down to lack of ability to buy books. Books are incredibly cheap now, and teachers, the vast majority of students are learning what they're learning in the classroom, not from the textbooks themselves. And by the way, I promise you, there are lots of people in this country who are charitable enough to give money to poor schools to ensure that kids can get textbooks. Right? Most private schools have scholarship programs for poor kids. In fact, I don't know of any private school that doesn't. So, sorry, did you? So I think that there does need, look, there has to be some sort of objective metric that we can use to do it on large scale. Now, I'm not saying that, the teacher who teaches their students and the kids all get 90s is better than the teacher who teaches their students and the kids all get 85. But I think it's a pretty fair statement to say that the teacher, if the classes are equal, right, you have to actually analyze whether the teachers are being given similar kids to work with, because they're not always. But if all other things being equal, the teacher whose kids are getting 90s is going to be better than the teacher whose kids are getting 50s, just on average. So I mean, you have to make bulk decisions in public policy. But again, I think one of the things that's amazing about local teaching is that everybody in a given school knows who the bad teachers are. I mean, really, if you go to a local school and the parents are involved, everyone knows who the crappy teachers are. It's really only when you federalize this thing and now you're trying to analyze teachers in aggregate that it's very difficult, and you have an impersonal system trying to judge teachers. This is why I think local control is the best. I know all of my kids' teachers personally. I know which ones are good and which ones are not. When I was going to school, my parents knew too. If you don't have good parents, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to succeed unless there's a community that's there to pick you up. So I really believe strongly in parenting and social institutions as the greatest aid to teachers. Yeah, sure, come shake the hand. Yeah, let's do it. So one of the things that when it comes to debate, there are two considerations. One is whether the debate is going to be productive, and the other is whether I'm lending credence to viewpoints that I find morally abominable. And even if I were to do a debate with somebody like Richard Spencer, and I were to crush him, as I undoubtedly would, If that were to... I do not wish to grant Richard Spencer the legitimacy of getting on a stage with him because I think that he is a moral monster. I think he's a bad human being who believes morally bad things. And getting on a stage with him legitimizes this view. So this is why, I mean, it's a consideration that I take into account on the left too. I mean, this is a simple rule that I have across the board. There's certainly, if there is somebody who held views on IQ differences between races and wanted to talk about that, like a Charles Murray, who actually is considered about his opinions on these things and is not a racist, then I would be happy to talk with Charles Murray, for example, and I think that we'd find a fair bit of common ground because he's a data-based guy. But I think that whenever I've become prominent enough, and not to sound arrogant, but I've become prominent enough that for me to get on a stage with somebody who's a pig would only essentially give the pig wings in the eyes of his own followers and grants a legitimacy that has been unearned to that person. James Damore, yeah.
In 2012, you celebrated the fact that Pappy Cannon was fired from MSNBC.
Right.
If you're pushing for free speech and absolutism.
So what I said about Pappy Cannon at MSNBC was actually not a celebration of his firing. What I said is that if MSNBC was going to fire him for his viewpoint, then they should have done that 20 years ago because his viewpoint's been clear for 20 years. That's what I actually wrote in the column. I didn't say that he should have been fired. I said that it was disingenuous, if I remember the column correctly. What I was saying, and it was 5 years ago, but go back and read it. I'm fairly certain what I was saying is that the reason that MSNBC gave for firing Pat Buchanan was actually disingenuous because the reason that they were giving was not the reason. He had been saying this kind of stuff for 20 years. So that's what I said. As far as whether people should be fired, I think that for their political views, the question does go to the core of their capacity to perform their job properly. So, you know, if I've changed on that, then I've changed on it, I guess. I don't think that I did. I'd have to go back and read the column over. If I got it wrong, I apologize for getting it wrong then, I suppose. But that's my opinion now. Sure.
I've heard you argue that some blacks, minorities, and leftists kind of seem lazy, blaming things other than themselves as white privilege. I agree that the American dream is based off hard work and their own individual choices as well. But I do feel there was one factor that I haven't heard you hit home on. Do you think that because of over 400 years of suppression, African Americans face, there is a psychological effect still seated in their culture that is preventing them to succeed in our American capitalistic society? What if this group was split? Would whites be able to have the same financial and educational success as blacks if they were enslaved and oppressed for hundreds of years?
So as I've said, I think that when it comes to histories of groups, obviously there are after effects. I don't like the argument on psychological after effects because every individual's psyche is affected by how they grow up now. Not by slavery 200 years ago, but how they grow up now. And this is why I strenuously object to the idea that, first of all, I couldn't hear some of your questions as far as laziness. I've said that if people don't succeed across race in the United States, that it may have something to do with the life choices that they make. I would never say that blacks are inherently lazy or anything ridiculous like that. That's stupid. As far as the question with regard to the ingrained psychological conditions, for example, I don't buy the argument that you are relieved of individual responsibility for making the right choices because bad things happen to your grandfather or your father, or even to you. You are required to make good decisions, right? I mean, not to harp on my Jewish background, but Jews have not exactly had a wonderful history of being treated wonderfully in various societies, and yet Jews have somehow been able to value education, marriage, make good choices disproportionately. And there are black people who do this too. Like Clarence Thomas's family, his dad was a sharecropper, right? How does Clarence Thomas end up on the Supreme Court? So I don't like these arguments that there's a social psychology that is inherently there and that can't be relieved. If it is there, then it needs to be relieved. And this is why I don't like the idea. I think it was really damaging that President Obama made a big point out of this idea that America is inherently racist, that the DNA of America is infused with racism, unalterably racist country, even to a certain degree, and that therefore this excuses bad behavior. bad behavior in the past or present does not excuse bad behavior now or bad decision making now. So it seems to me that we should stop focusing so much on stuff that happened 50 years ago if we want people to do better now. Well, I was talking earlier today with some folks over at ABC News, and we were talking about exactly this issue. And one thing that I was saying is the only thing that distinguishes whining about an issue from not whining about an issue is the possibility of a solution. If you're just going to talk about things that are bad happening in your life, people have had things bad happening in their life forever, since Adam and Eve. But if you're going to talk about what happened in the past because now it needs a solution, you need to recommend the solution for me. My solution in a free country is for you to make freely based good decisions that improve your life. And that doesn't require an explanation of past history. All that requires is you to do the right thing. And that seems to me not only the easiest argument, but the most moral argument on a general level and an individual level.
So then what would you suggest we do in low socioeconomic areas that you see kids continue to be in cycle of poverty?
So I think that what needs to happen is that people who run businesses need to go into impoverished areas, white and black, right? I mean, there's a huge white underclass as well. And we need to actually say to people, listen, you perform in school, we'll give you we will pay for your college, we'll pay for your scholarship to college, and then you will come work for us for 4 years. We need to actively recruit people into a better lifestyle. If your parents aren't going to do it, then we as a society need to do it. And that's not something I think government can do particularly well, because government has shown that it's incapable of doing it well, but I think social institutions can. We need to create surrogate family and community situations for people that are better than the ones that they are in if we want to improve their lives and give them an incentive forward toward good decision making. Now, I keep talking about the value of religion in American society. This is what churches and synagogues were there to do, right? It is our jobs to go out there, and mosques too, by the way. It is our job to go out there and improve lives by engendering a response that leads toward good decision making. And if we don't do it, then people are going to want the government to do it, and the government stinks at it, and the government's going to be oppressive when it does do it. So it's up to us to do that. It's up to us to push good ideas and good decision making on the private level, because otherwise the solution that's going to come down the pike is going to be something significantly worse from the federal government. Absolutely.
We will make America great again.